Public Relations. Edward L. Bernays. 1945. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 2. Public Relations in Action. 17. A typical survey finding America looks at nursing. In public relations, it is not only the individual organization or its product that needs to be integrated with society. Very often it is an entire group or profession. If we accept the sociologist's premise that our society is for the most part an aggregation of interest groups and group interests, we must also accept the conclusion that the mutual adjustment of these various groups is not always perfect. Some groups move ahead faster than others, and some lag behind. After a great cataclysm like a war, many groups discover that they are not so well integrated with society as they were before. In World War II and afterward, this very thing happened in many cases. Individual professions found themselves left behind by other faster-moving elements of society. Such situations offer a field of action for the public relations expert. We have worked with a number of professions, attempting first to find out what the maladjustments between them and society were, and then, after we found that out, making recommendations for adjustment. It may be interesting to examine one approach to this problem as a case method with practical implications for other professions. In spite of the tremendous stride that nursing had made in the past 3/4 of a century, the profession still faced problems after World War II whose solution depended on public understanding and support. On the one hand, there was an acute shortage of nurses affecting the health and well-being of the American people. On the other hand, the profession needed things for itself that were in the public interest. At its 1946 biennial convention, the American Nurses Association adopted a program calling for 1. Economic security, 2. Adequate legal control, and 3. Proper distribution of nursing service. In urging better pay, better hours, and better working conditions for nurses, the ANA followed a course designed to alleviate the shortage of nurses. This shortage was not due to any defection on the part of the nurses. Actually, there were more professional, registered nurses, over 300,000, than ever before in America's history. The demand for nursing care, however, had increased tremendously in recent years, far outstripping the supply. This deficiency could be made up only by improving the economic position of nurses, thereby attracting more people to the profession. So, too, when the ANA called for adequate legal control, it was seeking to protect the public by having uniform state licensing laws for the profession. Although professional nurses of every state have to be registered, practical nurses without any training are allowed to practice in many states of the Union. The third evil that the ANA wanted to correct was faulty distribution. Where there was one nurse for every 295 people living in cities, there was only one nurse for every 1,389 people in the rural areas. To achieve its program of economic security, adequate legal control, and proper distribution of nursing service, the ANA needed the public's support. But to obtain that support, it was necessary to inform the public, to make it aware of the importance of the nursing profession for the national health and welfare, and to make it understand why it was in the public interest to back the nurses program. In connection with this attempt to educate the public along these lines, I wrote a series of articles in 1946-47 for the American Journal of Nursing, published by the American Nurses Association. I tried to show that the nursing profession could not achieve its aims by itself, that it must also enlist the understanding and support of various social groups throughout the United States. Because the basic principles outlined for nursing are applicable to many professions, they are presented in this chapter. After giving some background material about the nursing profession, I will analyze the findings of the various surveys I made to determine the attitudes of the public toward nurses and the nursing profession. Most of the American people have little accurate knowledge of the nursing profession. But those who do have definite ideas about its achievements and inadequacies, and have made recommendations about how nurses as a group can be better integrated into our society. Here are a few of the facts and figures about this profession, which is so important to our well-being and about which we know relatively little. In 1946 there were 318,000 active registered nurses in the United States. During World War II, more than 103,000 nurses volunteered and about 76,000 served in the armed forces. Of the approximately 1,280 schools that gave nurses training to about 135,000 students, 69 admitted men students and 64 admitted Negro students. Only 138 offered an undergraduate program leading to a degree. Serving in 6,511 American hospitals were 144,724 nurses. These same hospitals employed 80,105 practical nurses and attendants. Public health programs employed 20,672 nurses. The remaining number were on private duty or were employed in special clinics and hospitals. The average graduate nurse earned from about $2,100 to $3,000 a year. The average public health nurse earned from about $2,644 to $4,000. The average nurse with the Veterans Administration, from $2,320 to $4,000. Representative sections of the American people, in response to surveys conducted in 1945-46, gave their opinions on nurses and their problems. Presumably they reflect the best informed thoughts and ideas on nursing and its problems, because the leaders of those groups that have the closest contact with nurses were questioned. Their answers apparently provide the key to the unspoken opinions of the majority of the American people, for in a democracy the leaders must reflect the attitudes and opinions of their constituencies. Doctors, nurses, writers, government officials, hospital administrators, servicemen, community leaders, teachers, businessmen, and social scientists were asked if they thought the nursing profession met their needs. These groups were selected for the survey for definite reasons. Physicians work very closely with nurses, and their attitudes directly influence the profession. Nurses themselves know, or should know, how well their profession is achieving its goals. Editors, radio commentators, columnists, authors, and publishers mold public opinion through the printed and spoken word. Local, state, and federal government officials exercise wide authority over nurses, since they frame and carry out legislation that vitally affects public health. During World War II, servicemen had the opportunity to form strong and lasting impressions about nurses. Obviously, therefore, 10 million returning military men and women would strongly influence public opinion. Hospital administrators employ the largest number of nurses and are instrumental in setting salaries and working standards. Educators mold the opinions of future nurses and of the public. Civic leaders generate community attitudes through activities in local business clubs, fraternal orders, and community welfare programs. Businessmen pay taxes and donate money to support hospitals and public welfare programs. Social scientists set the pace for future thinking and acting through their teaching and their publications. The survey showed that these groups had certain definite beliefs about nurses and the nursing profession. 1. Professional nurses were underpaid for the high type of service they rendered. 2. Fees for private duty nursing service were too high for the majority of people needing care. 3. Standards of nursing education should be raised, some college training, greater emphasis on bedside care and more specialized instructors were required. 4. Nurses should exhibit more sympathy toward their patients. 5. Sick people often sensed indifference in their nurses and consequently overlooked the importance of their work. 6. More men nurses were needed. 7. More Negro nurses ought to be employed. 8. More and more practical nurses should be employed to ease the critical nursing shortage and to free professional nurses for work demanding greater skill. 9. The nurse should interest herself in public health activities and voluntary medical aid plans. These plans would stimulate the employment of nurses by decreasing the cost of their services. 10. Closer cooperation should be established between the nurse and the doctor, hospital authorities and nursing organizations, to implement unity among all groups in the medical profession. 11. The nurse's excellent service in World War II had raised her prestige. 12. A public relations program was essential. Leaders themselves admitted they did not know as much as they should about nursing. They believed the public lacked information on this field. They thought a public relations program, planned to educate Americans about the types of nursing service available, and the goals and standards of the profession, should help the nurse to achieve professional status. Is nursing a profession? This question was put to social scientists because, as specialists in social relations, they should be best qualified to judge which occupations can be considered professions. But even they disagreed. About 50% of those who answered the question said that nursing as an occupation contained the elements necessary for professional status, a fundamental body of scientific knowledge, thorough education training, and licensure by the state without which a nurse cannot practice. The replies of the other 50% expressed a directly opposite view, that nurses cannot be professional because they are believed to be menial workers completely subordinated to doctors and do not command high enough pay to maintain professional status. We cannot settle this debate. Technically, the nurse is professional. But she cannot achieve true professional status until she raises her prestige. Prestige may result from demonstrable competence in nursing, higher salaries, evidence of greater interest in public affairs, and more independence. When government officials, hospital administrators, educators, and social scientists were asked whether they thought nurses were underpaid, the majority replied, yes. They believed that significantly higher salaries should be paid, because inadequate salaries failed to attract and retain the more intelligent persons. On the other hand, civic leaders, doctors, and businessmen thought that nurses were adequately paid. With the exception of hospital administrators, this division of opinion reflected the attitude generally held by employer and non-employer groups. As employers, businessmen, doctors, and most community leaders automatically opposed wage increases. Those who viewed the subject more objectively, because they were not immediately concerned with operating costs, advocated salary increases. Significantly, the majority in all groups queried opposed unions as the medium through which nurses might improve their economic status. Strong professional organizations were preferred to unions. Nevertheless, a vocal minority urged unionization as the only means by which nurses could bargain with their employers to raise pay, improve working conditions, and achieve public status commensurate with their responsibilities. To the question about remuneration, many editors, government officials, community leaders, and doctors countered with another: what will happen if the remuneration of nurses is raised? This group thought that fees for private duty nursing were already too high for the majority of persons who required nursing aid. Only businessmen, most of whom were better able to afford private nursing, declared that fees for such service were not excessive. This conflict between what nurses should be paid and what hospitals and private duty nurses could charge is serious. It is a common economic phenomenon and only a part of the general relationship between wages and prices. Despite this fact, and despite the fact that most of our editors, government officials, civic leaders, and physicians recognized this conflict, few of them offered any concrete ideas for resolving it. The majority of the affirmative suggestions favored medical prepayment plans. Asked whether educational standards in the nursing profession were adequate, the leaders in all fields agreed that educational standards needed a boost. They urged the inclusion of courses in psychology and the humanities in nursing school curricula. They wanted the nurse to be abreast of current affairs and conversant with cultural topics. Nurses themselves revealed a desire to learn more about community health problems. There was less widespread agreement about how to revise educational standards. Only educators and social scientists advocated 1 or 2 years of college. Social scientists and doctors proposed higher teaching standards, suggesting that teachers who are experts in specialized branches of medicine be represented on nursing school faculties. Social scientists and doctors also recommended that the profession be divided into the following 3 categories: 1. Executive and professional nurses with 3 or more years of training, some of it in college. 2. Nurses aides with 18 months to 2 years of training. 3. Practical nurses. Apparently editors, government officials, servicemen, businessmen, educators, civic leaders, and nurses agreed in principle with this plan, because they advocated both wider employment of practical nurses and higher educational standards for professional nurses. On the basis of this survey, we reached this general conclusion about education: most Americans, despite a lack of specific knowledge, overwhelmingly agreed that educational standards should be raised. Another question asked was this: are nurses sympathetic to their patients and to community welfare programs? Only a minority of editors, hospital administrators, servicemen, community leaders, businessmen, and social scientists thought nurses should change their attitudes toward patients and community. But we know that a minority with strong views can influence public opinion, and minority opinion often reflects the point of view of a large number of inarticulate people. This minority told us that nurses should be more sympathetic and less indifferent to their patients. Civic leaders and nurses themselves thought nurses needed more community spirit. Many people assumed that the nurse was aloof because she did not participate in important civic functions, but few pointed out that until recently the nurse's long work schedule had probably prevented her taking a normal part in community life. Former servicemen thought nurses were too conscious of their official rank. They disliked the regulations that prevented nurses from mixing socially with enlisted men. And some were convinced that even on-duty nurses gave more careful attention to officers. Editors, government officials, doctors, businessmen, social scientists, and nurses who answered our questions said that if nurses wanted to create jobs for themselves and to gain prestige, they had to become public health and community-minded. The majority opinion recommended broadening medical aid and prepayment plans to make nursing and general medical service available to people on all economic levels, because most Americans today cannot afford nursing fees. If prepayment plans were broadened, our respondents said, people could afford nursing care, and more nurses would be employed. Furthermore, the funds derived from such plans would ensure nurses a steady income. And finally, people would have more contact with nurses, would recognize their contributions to public health, and would have more respect for the nursing profession. Attitudes varied regarding socialized medicine, but the majority of editors, government officials, doctors, nurses, businessmen, and social scientists opposed it. At the same time, although the American Nurses Association had taken no stand on the universal plan set forth in the Wagner-Murray-Dingle bill, 63% of the nurses who answered our questionnaire favored such a plan. According to our respondents, public health activities were economically and socially important to the profession. Most of the groups included in the surveys were asked whether they favored wider employment of practical nurses, male nurses, and Negro nurses. All agreed that practical nurses were desirable, with the exception of hospital administrators, who said they would employ practical nurses only in psychiatric, tuberculosis, and chronic disease clinics and in hospitals for the aged and the convalescent. Presumably administrators thought the practical nurse was not skilled enough for duty in general hospitals caring for the acutely ill. Doctors did not agree, they wanted practical nurses in general hospitals. Hospital administrators, servicemen, nurses, civic leaders, and doctors favored the employment of men nurses. Businessmen were divided, probably because they were not familiar with them. Educators were lukewarm regarding the employment of men nurses, they thought incomes in this field were not enough to permit the support of families. Almost no one denies that Negro nurses are as capable as white nurses. Yet, in reply to our survey, both doctors and businessmen divided 50-50 on whether to employ Negro nurses. The attitudes of businessmen in our study reflected sectional feelings. The Northerners approved of Negro nurses, the Southerners did not. However, even those who agreed to the employment of Negro nurses said that they should work only in Negro hospitals. A minority opposed this segregation, suggesting that Negro nurses should at least be employed in all public hospitals. Our survey thus indicated qualified agreement that nursing should open its doors to men, Negro, and practical nurses. Do nurses cooperate with other groups in the medical profession? Doctors, servicemen, social scientists, and hospital administrators were queried about the nurse-doctor relationship. Their opinions varied widely, as was to be expected. Doctors thought no problem existed. Servicemen, even those not attached to the medical corps, were keenly aware of friction between nurses and doctors. They attributed it to an attitude of superiority among doctors and to their treatment of nurses as menials. Social scientists thought that doctors treated nurses as inferiors. The nurse's acceptance of an inferior role, they said, prevented her from attaining professional status, for as long as she was subservient to another group, she could not be fully professional herself. Only a few doctors had any specific ideas about improving the nurse-doctor relationship. They recommended interorganizational meetings, closer cooperation in nursing education and public health activities, and the exchange of literature. Hospital authorities and doctors alike thought nurses should develop closer working relationships with hospital administrators. They attached considerable importance to this recommendation, believing that managers would thus learn more about nurses' problems and aims and that nurses would feel that caring for the sick is a vital job. In this connection, doctors wisely suggested giving nurses some share in hospital administration. The nurse's relationship with her professional organization was not close, according to the results of a survey made among the nurses themselves. Certainly this was not good for the profession if nurses were to make their demands and aims known through their organizations. One recommendation repeatedly made by the nurses who answered the questionnaire was that their organizations should give greater responsibility and leadership to the younger members. The preponderant opinion of our respondents in all fields was that a public relations program was essential for the nursing profession. They said that all Americans needed more information about nursing. It was urged that education about nursing be provided through all information channels and aimed at all levels and sections of American life. Suggestions included stories and articles in popular magazines, radio broadcasts, movies, and newspaper coverage. Humanize nursing, they said, and make the public aware that nurses have undergone rigorous training for the service of their fellow men. They also urged that nurses participate in community activities which promote the general welfare and so make civic leaders conscious of the nurse's point of view and her place in society. A year was spent in obtaining and examining the opinions of American leaders regarding the nursing profession. What conclusions could we draw from our studies? Generally speaking. 1. Only a minority of all groups questioned was fully aware of the tremendous value of nursing service rendered and required in this country, and of the magnitude and diversity of the problems that nurses faced. 2. The leaders of those groups that are among the most prominent and important to American life, government officials, businessmen, and educators, for example, knew the least about nursing. Doctors were actually apathetic. Yet it was precisely these men and women who could and should be the most concerned with the nursing profession and make the American people aware of its services. 3. The conventions that for so long ruled the nursing profession made it necessary for nurses to do some hard thinking and to take action to achieve recognized professional standing and improve their economic status. In this connection, the following recommendations were made. Self-analysis. If nurses hope to advance professionally, they must take the lead in appraising their profession. Action to improve their economic status. Nurses could publicize their incomes by relating them to the cost of living and contrasting them with the salaries paid other professional people and skilled technical workers. They could learn more about hospital administration so that they would understand the relationship between the cost of operation and their salaries. Armed with these data, they could request salary increases that would be intelligible and realistic and could suggest administrative changes and other ways of making them feasible. To acquaint the community with their profession, nurses should become active in civic welfare functions and should develop an articulate attitude toward them. To inform the American people about their profession, nurses should launch a widespread educational and public relations program. This program could and should publicize their standards and aims so that the public would know them and be sympathetic to them. Such activities should be organized on national, state, and local levels. It should be effectively planned and coordinated. Its objectives should be kept clearly in mind. An integrated program of strategy, themes, timing, and tactics should be developed. This would benefit both the American people and the nursing profession. The effectiveness of such a program would depend in part on the adjustment of the nursing profession's own attitudes and action to the public needs, with such changes as might be indicated.